So let's start with the basics of CSS. So what is the syntax? First of all, between curly brackets, we are going to have pairs of property and value. This will define, for example, color red, which means that the text will be red. However, for us to know to which element, or for the browser to know to which element that style should be applied, we have the selector, which is the first part. The selector indicates that the following style is going to be applied to this element or to this group of elements. So let's see what type of selectors do we have. We have selectors by tag, meaning that we are picking HTML tags. So for example, in this example, we are selecting all divs. So in the example below, what would we be selecting? We would be selecting the div. Then we have selectors by class, meaning that we are going to select every element, and we don't care about which tag that element is. We are going to apply this to every element that has the class main content in this example. And once again, in this example, we are going to select the div. Then we can have selectors by ID, meaning that, as you know, IDs don't repeat in a web page. The ID is unique. So this means that a certain style will apply to that specific example. For example, that is very common for you to find is styles that are affecting the menu of the application. And in most applications, we only have one menu. The style will be in the style sheet, will have the ID. Then, of course, in this example, we would select the div once again. We have selectors by pseudo class. We have several pseudo classes. It's like first child, last child, and here we have hover. What is it going to be selected with this pseudo class? So imagine that we apply this pseudo class to the div. This means that when the user does a mouse over our div, those styles that were created for the hover are going to be applied to that element. Additionally, we can have selectors by attribute, in which we actually select a given element depending on the given attribute, so HTML attributes. And this is useful, for example, for using the disabled. In this case, we are actually selecting the input, but we can even create our own attributes. Okay, like in the platform, we can just go to the extended properties, create a specific attribute, and use it in the CSS. Finally, we can also create selectors by type. And here by type, we can mention that we are going to select everything that has the attribute type and that the attribute has the value checkbox. So in this example, it would be exactly the same thing. So more about selectors. When we are using pseudo-class selectors, have already seen, we are applying that to a given element. And in this example, we are using first child and last child. But notice that, first of all, we have here a new symbol, and we have here a space. A good mnemonic regarding the CSS is the following. When it does have a space or a symbol, we are going to the next element, and we are going to start to read from there. So imagine this case. So we are seeing here main content, space, and symbol. Okay, we are going to start from this. So how is that we can read this? And this is my preferred way, or the easiest, the way that I think that it's the easiest to do it. So we start by the end. We are going to select the first child that is a direct descendant, and this symbol actually means direct descendant of an element that has the class main content. So in the example below, what is that we are going to select? We are going to select the input type checkbox. Why? Because it's the first direct child of the element main content. And how about the second one? Try to read it yourself. So this can be read like the following. I'm going to select the last child that is direct descendant of an element that has the class main content. And in our example, we would be selecting this div. Selectors can be also by parent, as we have already seen. So in this example, once again, we have space or a symbol. So we have here a symbol. So we start by the end. So we are going to select all inputs that are of the type text that are direct descendant from an element that has the class main content. So looking to our example, which one are we going to select? This one or this one? If you answered this one, you are right. We are going to select this element. How about this one? Once again, we have space, we don't have a symbol, so we start by the end. Okay, I'm going to select all inputs that are direct and indirect. So I'm going to select all inputs that are inside an element that has the class main content. So in our example, how does it translate? To this, we are going to select every input. How about this selector? What is it that we are going to select? We have here a new symbol, and this symbol can be read like is immediately preceded by. So it has a symbol. So first of all, it has a space, then it has a symbol, so we start by the end. So I'm going to select all inputs that are immediately preceded by an input that is inside an element that has the class main content. So in our example, we will be selecting this one, this input. Why? Because first of all, it's an input, then it's preceded by another input, check here, and it's inside an element that has the class main content. Want more selectors? There is a bunch of them. People that are used to work with CSS, and depending on, for example, in what is the browser specifications that they are working on, people will tend to use all of these. So get to know them and get to at least to know that they exist. Additionally, selectors can be combined into combos, as we have already seen. So to apply the same style to several elements, we just create a combo, and to create a combo we use the comma. Comma means that we are going to apply the style to the element selected by the selector 1 and to the element selected by the selector 2. So here is an example of the platform. As you can see, we are applying this style, which is common for the table records. We are applying to the odd line and to the even line. Additionally, as we have already seen, we have selectors that allow us to select one element that is inside of another, and that is done with the space. Okay, so imagine in this example, we are saying that we want to apply the font size extra large to the element that has the class title that is inside an element that has the class head. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's a direct descendant or not. An example on the platform would be this div main content that is inside a TD that has the class main popup. Notice here this tag, minus service studio minus. This rule or this prefix allow us to create specific styles just for Service Studio. Meaning these styles, all of the browsers will look onto this and will not recognize the prefix, so the browser will not apply the style on one hand. On the other hand, the Service Studio, in the preview mode, it will apply this style. So in this example, for example, we are saying that the min height is auto, and but on Service Studio, the min height is 100 pixels. Okay, so we should apply this prefix whenever we want to override something to have a better preview. We have this, for example, when we have an element that is overlapping other elements, and as a consequence we cannot change the other elements unless we go to them by the tree. So this is not an acceptable situation. So this, in terms of code maintenance, is a nightmare. So to avoid this, we just need to use this prefix and just override the CSS that we need, so that we have a good preview, or so that the element is not on top of the other ones. Okay. Additionally, we can create combos such as using a tag, a class, and two attributes. So remember that way to read the selectors? Doesn't have a space, so I'll start from the beginning. So I'm going to select all inputs that have the class big, that have the attribute type equals to checkbox, and have the attribute disabled. Meaning we are going to select all inputs that have the class big, that are of the type checkbox, and that are disabled. What about this one? Can you understand what are we doing here? If not, try to read it yourself first. So first of all, notice the pseudo class hover and the pseudo class active. Okay, we already know what does the over do, but what about the active? Okay, the active means that, for example, when we are clicking on the element, that's the pseudo class active. So reading the rules, it's the following: a link on over that is inside the div that has the class deploy button, that is inside an element that has the ID container. And what about this one? So no space here. We are going to select all inputs that are disabled and on active, that are inside a div that has the class deploy button inside an element with the ID container. And to those two groups of elements, we are going to apply the background color red. So let's actually see the effect. So we have a link on over. The first part, it becomes red. What about the input? On click, it becomes red. So this is exactly what that rule is doing. Let's move on. So regarding still the syntax, how is that the browsers apply the styles? What is the order? How do they look to the CSS and know which style should be applied to each element? We have seen that we have selectors, but we have already seen that we can have multiple selectors selecting the same element. So what does the browser do? The first thing that we should know is that the most specific wins. This being said, if we do the style inline, as you can see below on the platform, it means that this is the most specific form of CSS. So this can only be overwritten in ways that we should not use, such as unimportant. So this means that we should try to avoid the inline CSS at all costs. Okay? The second one is the ID. Okay? The ID is the second most specific, but as we are going to see, we shouldn't use IDs with the platform. Then the third most specific is by class or by attribute. So notice this example, instructions here, and we are then applying on Service Studio the class. But notice that we are applying here, but also on the extended properties we are applying the same class. Do you know what's the difference between applying here and applying here the class? Well, the difference is, if we apply here the attribute class, if we add here the attribute class and then the class itself, what's going to happen is that in runtime, the application will be using this class. Okay, so whatever you put here will be ignored. It won't be sent to the customer. It won't be sent in the HTML. Okay, the element won't be using this class. On the other hand, if you remove the class from here, you actually, on development time, you lose the preview. which is something that we should try to avoid losing. So whenever you are doing conditional classes and so on, just type in here the default class so that we at least have a good preview of the element. And then here do all of the logic that you need to do to put here the class. And this is specific to the platform. Then in terms of the most specific, we have seen the inline style, the ID, the class or attribute. Then we have the HTML tags. So for example, here we are applying the style to these tags. Then finally, we have the asterisks, which means everything. We want to apply this style to every element on the page. So some specs that you're going to see on the web say that the ID should be used to apply the style to a single element, as we have seen, for example, the menu. And use the classes to apply the style to a class of elements, to, for example, when we are doing a record list. However, the OutSystems platform generates the ID, so we can't predict them. This means that we should use classes everywhere, and with this we don't have a problem. So we have seen the most specific wins. Then the second thing is the rule of priority. So the definition order does matter. So imagine that we are in your project and that we build this CSS, and then later on someone comes in and adds this CSS. And notice that the first class and the last class have exactly the same selector. What's going to happen? Well, this is exactly the same as having this. So with this, we overwritten the text alignment property because we changed it from justified to left. And how does this work? So the CSS is interpreted by the browser top down, means that the browser will start from the top, will start scanning the CSS, and when he actually finds this, joins these two. Why? Because they have exactly the same selector. So the properties get together. So for example, here the text alignment was overwritten, but here we added a new property, so the color, and it changed to red, and notice that the color appeared here. So this means that the last redefinition is the one that wants. It overrides the previous definition and eventually adds new ones. Where can we see an example of this? Whenever we use a base theme in our themes, this is directly translated to this. So this is in runtime. So this is development time and this is runtime. So in runtime, it means that we have all of our CSS here, so the CSS that we defined here. But notice that the CSS starts with an import. We'll look to this, we'll get this file, and we'll put the file in line, meaning instead of having this, all of the CSS of the theme black will show up here. This means that it starts scanning from the top of the CSS file, and then it continues here. So since the definition order matters, this means that all of these is going to be overriding what was defined on the theme black. So we have seen that the CSS definition order matters. But how does this apply to our reality? The reality of the OutSystems platform. So we know that the CSS can be done in several places, namely on the theme, on a page, or on a weblog. Can you guess what is the import order in runtime? Meaning, what is the CSS that the browser will import first, and then what is the CSS that he will import after, and what is the last CSS that he will import. So if you thought that it was first CSS to be imported, second, and then third, meaning that this CSS would be the first, then this would be added on the end of this, and finally this would be added on the end of all, meaning that this would be the one that would remain, you are wrong. The CSS import order is all of the CSS of all web blocks used on that page. Then the browser gets the theme CSS, and finally it gets the CSS of the page. Why? Simply because the idea of a weblog is to be a reusable element, meaning that it should be possible to reuse it cross theme. But for that, it means that the CSS of the theme must override the CSS of the weblog so that the component can have the look and feel of the theme where it is being applied. Finally, the most specific CSS is the one that is added on the page, meaning that we just want to change the CSS of this page. And this is just used in very specific use cases or very specific cases. Okay, so you can clearly see here the order that the browser is applying the style. The first one is the one that is coming from the screen. The second one is the one that is coming from the theme, and the last one is actually the one that is coming from the weblog. Okay? So we have seen these two rules. So the rule priority, how is it going to be applied, or what are the most specific elements. Then we have seen the definition order. Now the question here is, all of these elements have style, meaning we have classes defined and even the IDs have style associated. What is the order of the styles going to be applied to the text? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it, and please write it down. So if your answer was the style that's going to be applied is the style of the ID inner div, then the style of the outer div ID, then the style of the class inner, and then the style of the class outer, if this was your answer, it's wrong. Why? Because the class inner is more specific to the text than the ID outer div. So the order in which it's going to be applied is, it's going to be applied the inner div, the style of the inner div, then it's going to be applied the style of the class inner, you can see here, inner div, inner, and then it's going to be applied the style of the ID outer div, and finally the style associated with the class outer, which you can see here. Okay, so in terms of properties, CSS has tons of properties. So you have properties to change the text, such as the font or the color, or even transforming the text and spacing, alignment, direction. In terms of background, we can change colors, add patterns, add images, and so on. In terms of the box, which we are going to see later on, we can change the width and the height, the margin, the border, the shadow, and so on. And finally, the layout, where the element is positioned, if it's visible or not, if it's overflowing or not, white space, floating, so on. So whenever you are thinking about doing something, there's probably already CSS property for that.